All right, the game is Hell Hath No Fury. It's from a magazine called The Wargamer, issue number 39, from February 1985. And the, of course, term comes from some British playwright named William Congreve, according to Google. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, I think is the full saying. And that is a reference to Boudicca, who led a rebellion against the Romans in the 60s AD in Britain. So what you have here is a map of, pretty much southern Britain. Bunch of charts and tables up there. All sorts of things like terrain, supply check, demoralization record, various die roll modifiers, and of course the CRT up there in the top right. Bunch of activation requirements for tribes, a lot of stuff up there. A map that's kind of regarded as one of the ugliest, I guess, maybe in wargaming. You've got these, it's sort of this, I don't know, light yellow color. And then there's terrain. There's some mountainous terrain, which is that darker olive green there on the left. There's some swamps up there on the right, and this sort of pinkish, fleshy color, which is sort of rough terrain. Not particularly appealing. You've got these different tracts. So they're not hexes, they're not larger areas, they're very small areas, almost the size of a hex. You can see some of the counters stacked in these tracts. And they're irregular, in shape, and serve to demarcate areas. There are various tribal zones, which are named, like the attributees there, in that sort of dark border, some of which is a river, and some of which is simply a land border around their territory. So the tribal areas are demarked by those darker lines, and they're named. The tracts are all numbered, and as you can see, they take a 2-digit alphabetic code, which is an abbreviation for the tribal land that they're in, and then just a numerical value that counts up, from 0. There's a turn track along the bottom where Roman reinforcements sit. And this is actually almost the completed setup of this game. The general gist of things is the tribal player is seeking to activate various tribes in his rebellion or her rebellion against the Romans. The game starts with a couple of tribes activated. The Roman player, of course, is trying to crush the rebellion. There's some specific rules about how you win. And generally, the Roman player can win. Let's see here. How does he win? Let's go and look at this really quick. Well, I'll get back to that in a second because I can't find where it's listed. The rulebook is kind of a mess. There's, I don't know. It seems very convoluted. Victory condition. Well, those are variation victory conditions. Well, so essentially the tribal player wins if they can activate, and we'll talk about that, 8 lowland tribes, and the Roman player is trying to prevent that. There may be some alternate or sudden death type conditions I'm not remembering at the moment. But essentially the game starts with the Iceni, which was Boudicca's tribe, active, and you can see their units, the sort of light green color there on the map up in the Iceni tribal homeland. There are, in good imperial red, various Roman legions around. The 9th Hispania is generally over here. You've got the 2nd Augusta over here, and various other components of a couple of those, as well as the 20th in this general area. And then a whole slew of reinforcements, which most of them come in on this road from Wales over here. Paulinus, the imperial governor at the time, was at the time the rebellion happened, was in Wales killing Druids. And so that was one of the reasons, I think, that the British tribes chose to rebel when they did, because a large portion of the Roman army was off fighting in Wales. So what the tribal player is attempting to do is to fan the flames of his rebellion across these various tribal areas. And what he's going to be doing is sending units, hopefully probably his faster ones, to other tribal areas, seeking to raise those tribes in his rebellion. Now, there's some optional rules for variable activation of tribes that have to meet various criteria, and you sort of randomly select which criteria is in play at the time you're trying to activate the tribe. It seems a lot more complex, and I'm not sure what you get out of it, so I've chosen to ignore those. So the general basic activation rules are you just need to get a unit to a specific tribal center, and there may be one or two other small requirements, such as that the tribal area is not does not contain any active Roman units in it. So in a couple of cases, you may need to wipe out the small garrison forces that exist there. The tribal units for the tribal player are divided between lowland tribes, of which the Iceni are one, and you can see that by the light color of their counters. And then there's some highland tribes. I haven't put these out yet because most of the setup in this game is fixed based on a requirement in the rulebook. However, these two highland tribes, which are the Decaangli and the Ordovices, which are here and here, have pretty much free setup. And you kind of have to decide as the tribal player when you're setting them up what you want them to accomplish for you initially in the game, and it may matter where you put them. The two general paths you can take, I think, are either to try to slow up the Roman reinforcements by garrisoning this road that comes in from Wales. You won't win too many battles, but you'll definitely cause the Roman player and his powerful reinforcements to spend a turn or two, wiping you out of the way. So that's a possibility. The other possibility would be to try to actually take some of these cities and towns. Viroconium is here. There's a couple of other ones over here. You may be able to activate some tribes in this eastern area of the map with those guys, which may become as a bit of a surprise to the Roman player, who is probably expecting most of the activations to happen starting here in, I'm sorry, I said eastern, western, starting here in the west and the east and moving toward the west as the rebellion spreads. So you kind of have to figure out before you start, where you want to position these guys to accomplish either one of those two general tracks that you want to take. And I haven't kind of decided that yet. So those dark green are Highland tribes. There are various other ones. There's a whole bunch of bags. You can tell I'm not a wargamer because I don't have a nice black counter tray for this game. I need to get one because this setup took me, I think, over an hour pulling little guys out of little bags, and I haven't figured out a way, baggy-wise, to put this game away to aid the setup later. So I am going to try to probably invest in a counter tray for this particular one. But essentially, the tribal player wants to activate these lowland tribes, which generally speaking are in this central area, of the map. The highland tribes tend to be around the periphery. And 8 lowland tribes who are activated will win the game for the tribal player. Now, activation, at least in the basic game, is sort of guaranteed, and so it puts a huge time crunch on the Roman player, who has to try to get there and demoralize lowland tribes so that they don't count toward victory, because the true victory conditions are 8 undemoralized lowland tribes, and a tribe becomes demoralized, and there's a little handy record for that listed here, when they've sustained a certain percentage of losses in combat. And I think it looks like it's about half, although maybe not in every single instance. So the Roman player can't afford to wait and build up his forces for sort of an overwhelming battle or victory against the tribes, because it doesn't take too many turns for the tribal rebellion to spread with these fast chariot and horse units running out and activating tribes, and then their fast units, running down the road to activate the next tribe, and it sort of cascades as a series of activations. So the Roman player has to bring the tribes to battle soon, and probably means he's going to lose some of his legions, particularly the 9th Legion, which historically was what happened. The 9th Legion was essentially wiped out in this rebellion. And the victory conditions conspire to sort of make that fairly likely, because if you don't demoralize a couple of tribes, especially some of those big, strong, early ones, getting to 8 is not particularly hard for the tribal player. So there's that. As far as the units go, I don't know how far I'm able to zoom in here, but you have essentially, you've got these units that have a movement value, they have a battle, value, a combat value, and some other identifying type information to them. And the gist of the turn sequence is that the tribal player always goes first. He's the phasing player in the first part of the turn. And there's a rally phase, a supply check phase, an activation phase, movement, combat, and demoralization check. And then the other player does that same set of phases. Rally in this one is for trying to bring back units that have suffered adverse combat results. They can become, I forget the term that the rule is used, but they can basically become hit in combat to the point where they are not particularly useful, and you can rally them. Supply check involves the number of units in a tract. It's pretty liberal, and so large stacks are definitely doable. And it's based on the strength points and the number of counters, and so it's pretty hard to overstack. In some of the marshland type hexes, you can probably manage to overstack yourself, but for the most part, fairly large stacks can coexist or can exist fine in the tracks. You then have an activation phase, which is when you would potentially bring in additional tribes if they've met the activation requirements. There are some tribes, let's see, the Brigantes and the Regnenses can actually come in, they have a pro-Roman faction to them. Those tribes are split. And so when one side activates, the other side could activate. There's also one tribe, I forget who this is, Parisi, which actually could come in on either side. So rather than two different factions activating, one for the Roman and one for the tribal player, the Parisi could go either way. So some of the activations come at a cost for the tribal player, but if the Romans don't cause some of the tribes to become demoralized early, the tribal player doesn't even really have to go for those tribes that may have a Roman component to them. The Brigantes up here have some pro-Roman components in the Parisi over there. So the tribal player can win without even having to go that far if the Roman player doesn't attack very quickly. And that happened in the first time I played. I didn't press hard enough with the Romans, and the tribal player sort of cruised to an easy activation victory. After activation, you do movement, so you move all your guys, and there's a certain length, certain distance they can move. There's lots of terrain effects for the different types of terrain. Roads, of course, give you a bonus. I think they kind of missed an opportunity here with these tracks. The size of the tracks doesn't seem to correspond at all to the type of terrain they're in. If you remember the old Avalon Hill game Kingmaker, it also had a map that was somewhat, I guess, reminiscent of this in that it had those sort of irregular tracked areas to it. But that game was really neat because in an area where there was a lot of hilly terrain or marsh terrain, like for example here, or maybe in the Downlands area or over here, or of course in Wales, the areas that you had to move through got smaller, physically smaller on the board. And in the lowland areas where movement was relatively easy, the size of the areas was bigger. And what that did was it sort of baked in the terrain effects of moving through rough or difficult terrain into the size of the areas. So you could imagine yourself moving, very slowly, if your movement rate was 3 areas, let's say, 3 larger areas could get you pretty far in the lowlands, but 3 small areas would have you crawling through the rough terrain. And I wonder, in some senses, why they didn't do this. Instead, we get, this, the terrain effects chart with its effect on, movement, supply, and combat. I guess this was from a day and age where that wasn't considered over the top. I don't know. There's also some limited sea movement in the game, and the Roman player can make use of his flotillas. There's a couple of them that start the game here, and they can sail through these sea areas. They're demarked by these red lines, and they can actually sail around Land's End, which is down here, using these boxes, which are, of course, logically placed way over here. And they can come back around on the Iris C side of things. So you could try to move some units more quickly with the fleet. There's a lot of risk that you'll sink, particularly when you're going around Land's End. So it doesn't seem to be a particularly high percentage play there, but you know, you could try that. There's a sea movement table, what else? Right here, where you can see that on a die roll of 2 or less, you're lost at sea. And 2 or less, of course, on 2 dice doesn't seem like much, but there's all sorts of negative modifiers. Anyway, after movement, you have your combat that you've set up. And combat is kind of a different, well, it's an odds-based, which you see here. You convert strength points from the units into, you know, and compare the odds. But there's a ton of die roll modifiers and a ton of column shifts based on all sorts of different things, like the presence of leaders and a variant on how effective the tribes were. You have to roll a die and they may get a column shift in their favor or a column shift, you know, away from their favor based on the fact that in this particular battle they were scared or whatever, or not, or unruly, difficult to control. The tribes get a benefit the first time a tribe fights after it's been activated, representing kind of the surprise that the Romans would have, you know, encountered when the tribe rose up against them. So there's all sorts of crazy modifiers, and it's kind of funny because I think somebody said on Board Game Geek or someplace that you apply, you know, half a dozen to 10 modifiers and it ends up at a +1 or a +2, you know, column shift, or a one direction or, you know, one space column shift or whatever. So there's a lot of, you know, modifiers that may negate one another as you add them up. The time that I played, I was keeping track of all those on pieces of paper because there's really a lot of them, and it was pretty difficult. Oh yeah, there it is. Tribal Unreliability Table. So you roll a die and you figure out whether or not your tribe is particularly reliable this time. So anyway, there's that. After tribes take certain areas, and you'll see, it may be difficult to see on here, but like there's Londinium. It's a city. It's got kind of a octagon or hexagon shaped thing there. Certain locations can be sacked or looted, and the tribal player, if he conquers them, may end up having all of the units that were involved in that fight hang around and loot for a while. That's actually to his disadvantage. There's no economics in the game per se, so looting doesn't get you anything. It actually just means you can't control those units for a couple of turns while they sack the city. So you'd actually prefer, as the tribal player, not to have the looting, you know, really happen. I talked about road bonus, and you can force march, and all the sort of normal stuff that you'd expect from a war game. There is overrun, which I guess I kind of get at this scale. I don't know. I guess it really means that you've basically suppressed a weak faction and can, you know, in an area, and can just move more, you know, more people through. Lots of rules about stacking. But again, the stacking is really just relevant in the supply check phase. And if you see, I don't know if I have it, if there's actually a table for it, oddly enough. You may not. Oh, here we go, supply, yeah. So like a clear area can stack 12 tribal units or 15 Roman units. Low hills, 10 Roman, 8 tribal. High hills, 6 Roman, 4 tribal. I mean, they're pretty... Marsh is 4 and 4. So that's not as many. But then certain towns and stuff add to the units. So Roman center or tribal center adds 3 units to the stacking that otherwise would be there. Settlements add a couple or add 1, so forth. So, you know, like I said, you can build some pretty tall stacks in here, and you know, when you do the supply check, you're really just eliminating units above supply limits at a certain roll. So you could even take a chance and kind of overstack temporarily if you thought you wanted to. So when the tribes, you know, rebel and they've got a bunch of counters, they'll tend to sort of accrete into these task forces as you sort of have, you know, reason to send them here and there. And the stacks can grow pretty tall. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not much of a war gamer, so I can't really tell you if there's, uh, lots of weird, interesting rules here. There are chariots. A bunch of the tribal units have chariots, which really don't seem to be particularly powerful. Here's one, and whoa, it's kind of blurry. Yeah, it's not cooperating particularly well here, but they're fast, relatively speaking, although horse units are pretty much just as fast. They can charge in combat, which increases temporarily their firepower, but also increases their odds of taking losses in the resulting combat. So, you can use them for that. The Roman player gets several benefits to the Roman legions due to their discipline and, better combat ability and so forth. So there's certain things when several cohorts from a legion are stacked together in a combat, they get a combat bonus. Moving, they get a bonus. Moving through rough terrain, they don't have to stop as frequently or don't have to take as many movement, point hits as the tribal units do. So some stuff, sort of showing the Roman discipline and better fighting ability. So there's optional rules. The one I think I already talked about was the variable activation requirements. I mean, it takes up, like 3 or 4 columns in this rule book. So it's pretty involved. It's kind of at the individual tribal level, and then there's a table way back here. Well, I don't know if you would even call it a table, but a series of sort of little sections that indicate the various activation requirements for tribes. So that one's particularly, onerous from a player perspective. I could maybe see doing it if I was playing it against somebody who also knew the rules of the game. But when I'm playing solitaire, there's enough to think about when playing both sides. I don't really feel like it's all that useful. Probably add some apparent realism to it, I suppose. All of the activation requirements seem relatively plausible. I don't know. But what's interesting about these is that in some cases, 1 or 2 of the requirements, there's 3 requirements for every tribe, and in some cases the requirements are actually easier than the basic game. However, you don't know which one is going to be called for until you try to activate. If you fail activation with this variant, activation is always automatic in the base game, but if you fail activation with this variant, then you need to adhere to all 3 requirements to then bring the tribe in, try to activate them a second time. So there's a huge penalty for failure that you really probably don't want to incur. So other optional rules, there's this Second Legion restriction. Historically, the Second Legion kind of hung out around Glavum over here and didn't participate in the defense of the cities until Paulinus came and actually relieved the commander. I think his name was Postumus, who eventually, I believe, committed suicide. And Paulinus took personal command of that legion to get them moving. So there's a rule that says that legion can't move anywhere until certain criteria are met, which typically involves the tribal player attacking them or Paulinus getting over there. That certainly would seem to make things significantly harder for the Roman player, because the Second Augusta is a very powerful legion and is stacked all together, and could easily take out probably any tribal, army that it comes across. What else do they have? Movement of disrupted units. There's some rules about what, where, and how they're allowed to move after combat before they get rallied. There's centers and Roman fortifications, garrison rules, and things like that. There's a few, they seem to either be slightly Roman, toward the Roman player in terms of benefit, or slightly toward the tribal player, I would say. The Augusta restriction is definitely a detriment to the Romans. The variable activation is probably a detriment to the tribal player. Movement of disrupted units probably doesn't matter that much. And centers and Roman fortifications are probably fairly neutral also. So it would seem like you probably want to do all of the optional rules, together, I guess. Or unless you're trying to maybe balance the game out by giving one player an easier time of it. I suppose you could try that too. So that's pretty much the game. The magazine had a bunch of articles about Roman Britain. This isn't as useful for me now than maybe it would have been for somebody who was playing this game in 1985. Because with the internet, I can learn all I want to learn about Roman Britain without having to resort to this magazine. There's other things in here, reviews of other... look, Rummel in the Desert, an advertisement, Colombia. Huh. So, yeah, some of this may be of interest to some folks who have a sort of a history in wargaming. I didn't find anything too particularly interesting here. I did read through some of the background on Roman Britain, and it was kind of interesting. They did have a bibliography. Of course, probably pretty dated by now. Examples of play, some stuff like that. So that's kind of nice. Other than that, that's a pretty much overview of the game, and I'll probably try to play through a turn or two.